All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started on our last unit of the year. So I appreciate everybody and their work throughout this remote learning. I know this was a definitely an unexpected thing and something that we were all trying to figure out as we went through. But for the most part, you guys have been keeping up and doing the work and turning things in. Turn-in rate has been pretty high, surprisingly. So I appreciate your efforts and everything you guys have been doing. So we're heading into our last unit here. We're only going to have basically a couple of more weeks. We're going to do the civil rights movement. This unit's going to be structured a little bit different than what we did with the Cold War unit. This first week's going to be basically kind of preloading you with general information and things of that nature about the civil rights movement. And then next week will be the extension assignment that we're going to do that is going to kind of wrap up this unit and then kind of wrap up our year and finish out great. So we're going to get started here with the segregation and the civil rights movement. So you guys all have heard of the civil rights movement. This is not a new term or a new concept that you guys are hearing for the first time. But understanding exactly what was going on and the details of it, besides, just knowing the names of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other names like that. This unit's going to be diving into some of that and then diving into maybe some of the names and events that maybe you haven't heard of as much about. The civil rights movement has been depicted in countless movies over the years. Dating back, Remember the Titans, Hidden Figures, one of the more recent movies, Mississippi Burning. There's literally hundreds of movies probably that depict some aspect of the civil rights movement. So we're going to kind of get into it and go from there. So the first main goals of the civil rights movement. All right. Obviously, they wanted to end segregation. They wanted to protect the voting rights, especially of minorities, African Americans. They wanted more freedoms in society and more social equality, to be equal, to be seen as equal. This obviously was a problem as a result, especially down in the South, but really throughout the country. This was not just an isolated thing in the South. It was certainly more dramatic in the South than it was in northern states or even out west. But understand that segregation, racism, inequality, things of that nature was common throughout the United States and not just focused and isolated in the southern states, like sometimes we kind of make the assumption that it is. Segregation. You guys should be aware of what segregation was. Basically, the enforced separation of different racial groups within society. Obviously, for this unit, we're focused on whites and blacks, the separation of whites from African Americans. To help end this racial segregation, there was a young individual, Dr. Martin Luther King. You guys have all heard of him. He kind of spearheaded and kind of rose to power and kind of became a figurehead, kind of the face and the name to go with the civil rights movement. One of the reasons his popularity soared, he was an amazing speaker, could hold the attention of a crowd incredibly well. The way he spoke, the things that he said, just captivated people. And one of his big things was he preached the use of what we call civil disobedience. One of his mentors, one of the people that he studied, was Mahatma Gandhi, who was fighting racial injustice in Africa. Apartheid, which apartheid basically is the same thing as segregation here in the United States, just took place in Africa. So he kind of studied Mahatma Gandhi, the way he did things, the way he got change. And a lot of that was through civil disobedience. Basically, civil disobedience is if a citizen citizens have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, but, and this is important, to do it peacefully and non-violently. Um, don't be violent. That's just going to add to the fears. It doesn't matter what happens to you as an African American. If you retaliate in a physical way, it's going to hold all those myths to be true. It doesn't matter if an African American is getting beat up by 5 white people. If that African American throws one punch, they're going to say, see, he's violent, and so he wanted to preach this nonviolent way. And he believed that this was going to be a better way to get the attention and to um, push forward to make things better for African Americans for generations and years to come. The question is, do you remember why segregation happened? This is stuff that we talked about in a previous unit earlier in the year. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1898. Hopefully some of you can remember that. The Supreme Court case that made racial segregation legal throughout the nation. If you remember the Plessy v. Ferguson case, Plessy was a guy that tried to ride the white-only train car in Louisiana in the South in the mid-1890s. He paid for his ticket, got on the train. He refused to ride in the colored car. He wanted to ride in the white car. Again, this was set up. This is civil disobedience. He wanted to get arrested because he wanted attention drawn to this. And up until this point, segregation was kind of one of those things that people weren't really sure if you could do it legally or not. And as a result of this case, the Supreme Court basically told the entire country that it is legal to separate the races if you would like, separate but equal, Jim Crow laws. This institutionalized racism. This allowed racism to basically be legal in this country. And this is what's going to lead to ultimately the Jim Crow laws, the white and colored. Obviously, this image here, you can see, yes, they both have access to a drinking fountain. However, do they look equal? Clearly, they don't. I could go through hundreds of pictures similar to this, and you can see that even though they are separate, they are certainly not equal. But unfortunately, this is going to be the situation, especially in the South, for close to the next 60 years. In 1954, you have Brown versus the Board of Education, and this is what's going to overturn that decision that was made in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1898. In this case, Brown, Topeka, Kansas, this was a young girl who had to go to a colored school that was like 8 blocks from her home. There was a white school that was only a couple of blocks from her home. And this was only one case of a handful that were brought up through the court system. What commonly the Supreme Court does is they'll combine like cases into one case. In this case, Brown happened to be the first letter in the alphabet of all of the people in. So this is why it came under Brown versus the Board of Education. Modern day, it comes down to who filed first, for example. So whoever filed their case first, that name is what gets attached to it. So in this case, Brown B being the earliest letter in the alphabet for one of the plaintiffs, it becomes known as Brown versus the Board of Education. However, you do need to know or want to remember that this was a collection of several cases that were brought forth to challenge this segregated school system. The Supreme Court ruled that public education fell under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, making segregated schools illegal. So now at this point, with this decision, the schools have to start the process of desegregation, where you're going to start to have blacks and whites going to school together. However, despite this case ruling in 1954, there was one major problem that they did not address with this court case. That is when and how this new ruling was going to be enforced. The Supreme Court did not state a deadline for when schools had to desegregate. So even though the law says you have to desegregate schools, there was no law or requirement as to when you had to do this by. So schools that didn't want to desegregate are going to do all kinds of different things to basically drag out this process. They're going to make excuse after excuse why they can't do it and whatnot. Eventually, obviously, this is going to start to happen slowly. But unfortunately, because there was no time constraint put on it, it's going to take quite some time. The first act that's going to do this is what's called the Little Rock Nine in 1957. And in this case, basically, the local governors refused to desegregate schools. In Little Rock, Arkansas, this was a district that was divided, decided to slowly desegregate. They started with 9 high school students. And this stuff went pretty high. The governor of Arkansas, the most powerful political leader of the state, is the governor. And in this case, the governor called out the National Guard to block desegregation. He brought these people out to stop these 9 individuals from attending school at Little Rock High School, or Little Rock Central High School. Angry mobs met. 9 students tried to enter. None of them made it to school that day. In fact, it took several weeks before they were able to actually get in to the school building. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock to help enforce the 1954 ruling, and basically escorted these 9 students to and from school for almost a year. And in fact, to fight desegregation, a lot of schools, especially in the South, literally shut down. Little Rock High School being one of them. They shut down for a year. So the year after this, they didn't even open up the school to fight desegregation. Here's a picture of the original 9, of the Little Rock 9. One of the most famous images, this lady here, I always loved her face. This was one of the students who was entering Little Rock High School or trying to enroll to be a student. Obviously, they faced a lot of racism, violence, things of that nature. Picture of the federal troops escorting the students to and from school. And this, again, was a daily thing. This didn't happen for the first few days or the first few weeks. This happened the entire school year. Just some more images. So desegregation, it starts with the schools, but it is going to fall into other areas. Fighting segregation, there are going to be a number of events that are going to help fight segregation and raise awareness to end segregation. Some of these events are freedom rides, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Streetsboro sit-in, March on Washington, the famous Martin Luther King Jr. speech, I Have a Dream, that was part of that March on Washington. And there were numerous events that I don't have listed here, and countless people that you've never heard of that were really the foundation of this civil rights movement. And in the extension exercise we're going to do, or activity that we're going to do next week, you're going to learn more about these events as well as some other ones. All of these events are going to lead to action, and change is going to happen. A couple of the examples of the change, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which when passed basically ended segregation legally, and it banned discrimination based on race and sex. And eventually, as we move forward, other minorities are going to come in for civil rights, including women, Latinos, and other races as well. This is also going to lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is going to allow everyone to vote. Now, we know from previous classes that African Americans were granted the right to vote. However, because of literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and things we've talked about, a lot of African Americans never were actually able to vote. They couldn't afford to pay the tax. They couldn't pass a literacy test, which, if you recall, none of you passed my literacy test. And because of that, and those things were in play until 1965, when this act was passed that basically outlawed the use of poll taxes and literacy tests and things of that nature. This is also going to lead to affirmative action, which has taken different forms throughout the year. Originally was signed in 1961 for government jobs, but basically this just says you have to give equal opportunities to people regardless of their race. You can't just hire white people, that you have to give consideration and hire African Americans and other minority races as well. Now, this was a very brief introduction to the civil rights movement. Obviously, there's much more to this, and we still fight, obviously, civil rights today. There's still obviously racial issues in this country. We see them all the time. But through this unit, you're going to learn more about these events and more about these people through the rest of this week. And then you're going to apply all of this to your extension assignment next week.